Here are three Republican former federal prosecutors speaking about President Trump for an organization called Republicans for the Rule of Law.
This administration, in my view, has an absolute disregard for the law.
The Mueller report makes a very strong case on obstruction of justice.
Were the president anybody other than the president, he would have been subject to indictment.
Joining us now is founder of Republicans for the Rule of Law, Bill Kristol. Bill, thank you very much for joining us tonight. So they have highlighted copies of the Mueller report now. So what happens next, do you think?
We wanted to make it easy for them and deprive them of the excuse that somehow it's too hard for them to read it. I don't know what happens next. What happens next is I hope more Republicans on the Hill get serious about their constitutional obligations. And one thing we're trying to do, though, obviously, is put a flag in the ground for those Republicans around the country, especially young Republicans or young people inclined towards conservatism or towards the Republican Party, who look at the Republicans on the Hill and are just appalled, look at Trump and are appalled, but who don't want to simply become liberal Democrats. It's fine if other people want to be liberal Democrats, but they don't. And to show them that there is an alternate view of what the Republican Party should be doing in this moment of challenge and even crisis.
Bill, you're a veteran of the first Bush administration, and you were not even in office when I remember being at work in the Senate, and a memo from Bill Kristol would arrive in the Republican Senate, and it would pull every single Republican member of the Senate in the direction you wanted them to go. Those days of influence are long gone, I guess, in the world of Trump. But it makes me wonder, is there a Bill Kristol today? Is there someone who you think in Republican life, probably a former office holder or someone like that, who, if you could pull into your effort, would somehow turn heads in the Senate or in the House?
You know, I'm not sure. It might take more than one person. Obviously, Bill Weld, I think, is doing the right thing, challenging Donald Trump in the Republican primary. Justin Amash, with whom I've differed on many, many issues, really did the right thing a couple of weeks ago. And I think the response to him was striking. And one thing I was struck by, Lawrence, is, you know, what people were impressed by the sobriety, the soundness of his explanation. I mean, it wasn't just an assertion. He really laid out the case in a brief way, but in a serious way. He then did a town hall. He didn't go on many TV shows at all, right? He turned down a zillion offers, as I'm sure you know, and instead did a town hall with his own constituents in a district that Trump carried, answered questions, including some of them from Trump supporters, really showed what it means to be a serious representative who takes his obligations seriously, who respects his own constituents, but isn't simply going to cave to them or to the noisiest group of them. And I think that's really important. And I would say one other thing. I hope what we've done might have some influence on the House Democrats and on Speaker Pelosi. People can make up their own minds about whether ultimately the case is there for impeachment. Maybe the case is just there for censure. Maybe nothing should be done. But I think it really is important that the House go through a serious set of hearings where they really look at the Mueller report. Basically, I assume the Mueller report's correct. No one's really challenged the facts. And then have serious people there, constitutional law professors and others, to say, okay, what is the right response? I'm not sure what the right response is. It might be the one would look at the whole thing and decide it falls a little short of impeachment. But to simply have a bunch of disconnected hearings and some subpoenas, and not take it seriously as a body, I think there's a real problem with that from the point of view of the rule of law and constitutional government.
And Bill Kristol gets tonight's last word. Thanks for joining us, Bill. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Lawrence.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.